the Boston Celtics, it is being very heavily covered right now that they, of course, have won the 2024 NBA Finals. We did a whole hour on it just yesterday, so I want to start off the show here by just giving some final thoughts on both the finals and this overall postseason for the NBA. And there's obviously so many different angles to talk about when you were discussing this Celtics championship. I feel like yesterday we were talking a lot about the collective of this Celtics team, but there are a couple people in that Celtics organization that I do feel like this has to be a little bit extra gratifying for, starting with Jaylen Brown, who became the highest paid player in NBA history last offseason. Now that is sure to be soonly history itself, where there's going to be a couple stars that will probably make more money than him this offseason, including his own teammate in Jason Tatum. But last year, it was Brown becoming the first $300 million man in the NBA, at least based off of solely team contracts. And the timing of it really wasn't great in terms of where the PR of Jaylen Brown was after the team had a really embarrassing loss to the Miami Heat in the Eastern Conference Finals, playing the 7th seeded Heat, and based off of, or the 8th seeded Heat, I should say, and the fact that in Game 7, we see Jason Tatum roll his ankle in the first minute or so of that game, and people were sort of looking to Jaylen Brown to, come up with something and establish himself as the star that the team needed in that instance, but he couldn't in that game, and it was just a really rough series for him as a whole. I believe he finishes 8 of 23 in Game 7. We saw through the entirety of that postseason series that the Heat were maybe exposing Jaylen Brown a little bit in terms of his deficiencies from a ball handler standpoint. Averaged 3.6 turnovers per game, Jaylen did, and that's somebody who obviously has tons of talent and ability to create on the ball, but that's never really been his role with the Celtics. So that 3.6 was pretty devastating for the Celtics at the time, but ultimately it clearly pushed him to continue improving. Jaylen Brown, I think, has been the epitome of somebody who offseason after offseason continues to get better, and some of the ball handling stuff was definitely part of that conversation, but also for Jaylen, it was, and not just Jaylen, of course Jason Tatum is involved in this as well, is the maturity aspect of them understanding that they need to adapt and if they ever want to win a finals together, and I think that that's exactly what they did. And for Jaylen Brown to receive all of the criticism that he did during the offseason and even early on in the year, I know at least from myself living in Massachusetts, there was a lot of negativity towards him from a lot of the local Boston media outlets in terms of, well, this is the guy we're paying all that much money to, and I never thought it was a question that Jaylen Brown, especially with his history, is never going to be a negative asset, and in fact he proved to be one of the most valuable assets as he goes on to win Finals MVP, and especially after he was snubbed from All-NBA this season. He's talked about how he felt like he should have been All-Defense. I'll just leave it at that. Don't know if I necessarily am there with him on it, but for him to be as important as he was during these playoffs, winning the Eastern Conference Finals MVP and the Finals MVP, nobody can say anything about his contract anymore. And also, for whatever it's worth, I feel like the fact that he did win these awards instead of Jason Tatum probably gives Tatum still a little bit more to push towards, where as much as this season was just about winning the championship, winning a Finals MVP is going to be something on Jason Tatum's checklist that he is desperately going to want to cross off. So that is almost a little bit of a benefit for the Celtics that he didn't end up winning it this year. But the other person I really want to highlight here is Joe Mazzulla, who deserves a ton of credit. Another person who, especially, again, I think from a national media perspective, definitely got some flack, but I know here in Boston, it was not a great rookie head coach season for Joe Mazzulla. And that's where, again, we can absolutely, praise him for what he is now, because I think that the growth has been tremendous. Last season was very rough at times, and the whole situation leading into him being put in this position of Ime Udoka and his off the court stuff, coming off of a finals appearance, puts that much pressure on Joe Mazzulla. And then also considering the fact that Udoka ended up getting hired by the Rockets partway through last year. So a lot of Mazzulla's assistant coaches, which he didn't even pick out himself headed into the year, they end up leaving him. And it's a very bare bones coaching staff, and he's just sort of put out there into the fire to fend for himself. And the improvement from year 1 to year 2 has been absolutely tremendous for him. So I think that he deserves a lot of praise for the way that he was able to adapt and the ways that he was able to learn from his mistakes in year 1. But outside of just the Celtics, because me personally, I am a Celtics fan, so I was definitely entertained myself because the Celtics were winning the first finals that I've ever really been able to appreciate. But, overall with this playoffs, it was pretty underwhelming, just in terms of, I love basketball. I have fun watching these games and just analyzing everything anyways, but it feels like there was an absence of these classic games. And the Celtics, they go on to win the championship. They never really had their backs up against the wall. Now, their biggest moment, I would say, comes in Game 1 of the Eastern Conference Finals, where they were playing the Indiana Pacers. It took a couple turnovers there from Indiana, the big shot from Jaylen Brown in the corner, and then Jason Tatum taking over in overtime. That felt like the biggest moment for this Celtics playoff run. But overall, again, they just weren't super heavily tested, which in the eyes of a lot of people too sort of diminishes their playoff run. I think it means that they were just that dominant, that there wasn't ever really any drama with them. But outside of just the Celtics lens of all of this, we got just 3 Game 7s, and wasn't exactly a super compelling group of them. The Pacers destroyed the Knicks 130-109, and that is sort of baked into the other conversation here of we just saw so many stars injured, which definitely hurt the overall quality and intrigue of the playoffs. But Game 7, Pacers' Knicks wasn't really anything. There was a really strange one between the Denver Nuggets and the Minnesota Timberwolves in the Western Conference semifinals as well, where the two teams basically took turns blowing each other out, and the Wolves ended up winning by 8. It wasn't this, demolishing type of competition, but Minnesota took a double-digit lead in that game with 3 minutes left, and I didn't really think that there were any doubts from there on out, at least, the feel of the game from as I was watching. Maybe I'm being too critical. Maybe you still felt like the Nuggets were going to be able to come back, but it didn't make it out to be what should have and could have been this iconic Game 7 matchup between two of the best teams in the league. And then really, in my opinion, the best of the Game 7s was the Cleveland Cavaliers versus the Orlando Magic in the first round. It was Donovan Mitchell versus Paolo Banchero, and both of them were tremendous in this game. Donovan Mitchell was on an all-time heater from Game 6 and Game 7, combining for 89 points. Just a tremendous closeout effort there from him. And the fact that the Cavaliers were down by, I think it was 18 points in this game during the first half, and they pulled off the biggest Game 7 comeback since 1998. But people just didn't care as much about this series and about these teams. Neither one of them were really considered true contenders. The Magic never got any of the credit that they kind of deserved during the regular season. No national media games basically. So maybe they had one, but people just weren't really all familiar with the Magic, and they neither one of these teams really played, the most aesthetically appealing game, at least in 2024, where at least the Magic are solely built off of defense and, star creation from Paolo Banchero. But I thought it was interesting that John Lewis of Sports Media Watch wrote an article about how the playoffs saw a significant decline in viewership and ratings from last year. Ratings were down 11%, viewership down by 12%, and reported that the finals have gone 5 straight years now without any game reaching 14 million viewers at any point. And he added some context as well that in the MLB, the World Series in 2021 hit that 14 million viewers mark as well. So obviously, there are a number of different things that sort of play into this. Listen, I understand there are a number of illegal streaming sites as well that do take away a little bit from the viewership numbers, but the fact of the matter still is that we haven't really gotten a number of these classic games in some times. Where you look at the past 5 finals, the last 2 of them were just 5 games between Celtics and Mavs and Nuggets and Heat last season. Only one of the last 5 finals had the average margin of victory in single digits. The average score differential in 2023 between the Nuggets and Heat was 9.4, and that was the lowest. So we're getting a ton of blowout games in these finals as well. And we haven't gotten a Game 7 since 2016 during the Warriors and Cavaliers series. So we're getting blowouts. We're not getting these long, drawn-out series. It feels like, for the most part, we're getting, I would say, at least a lot of sort of foregone conclusions. Now, 2022, the Warriors were favored. There was a lot of, those ESPN analytics stats that get thrown out about the Celtics and how they should have won that series, and the overall arc could have been entertaining, but average margin of victory in that series was 13.3. Not a single one of those games finished as a single-digit point differential. And it just stinks because, again, the NBA is so much fun. And, I personally love basketball. Again, I'm always going to be tuning into these games. But it doesn't feel like we're getting this climax that we feel like we should be getting in terms of, the postseason just not really living up to expectations. And, again, not totally sure what that is. Injuries definitely do play some sort of a role there. But also when you look at how this playoffs played out, it was the Celtics who were far and away the best team in the Eastern Conference, even with injuries to the Bucks, and you can say to the Sixers to some degree with Joel Embiid, even though he played, and with, the Knicks as well. I don't think any of those teams were beating the Celtics. And, then you go to the Western Conference, the top 3 teams, and the Nuggets, Timberwolves, and Mavericks, all of them were fully healthy, but we still just didn't get, again, it was sort of trading off blowouts. And I don't know if it's the 3-point variance that sort of comes into play there or what it is, but ultimately it was overall a pretty disappointing playoffs. But let me know if you think I'm being too down on the dumps. Again, I love the NBA. I'm always going to watch it. But when you look at the NHL playoffs and the excitement of basically every one of those games, it just doesn't feel like there is an equivalence. But again, let me know your thoughts in the comments section. We're going to be taking our first break of the show, though, and when we come back on the other side, we have some breaking news to dive into with the Detroit Pistons firing their head coach, Monty Williams. So stick with us, and we will be right back after this quick break.